What is the import of President Biden's democracy summit? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show, as y'all know, that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, discusses libertarian principles with you. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who has a nice, cush job teaching economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
You see what a bah humbug attitude he has. On the other hand, I'm trying to be festive. See, Christmas tree. I'm trying to be festive, but he's being naughty, not nice.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Richard.
Our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't have any classes right now. Is that right?
Oh, see, now he's insulting. He says I have no class. Actually, this has been a part of finals week. So what I am doing now is in the midst of grading the final exam so I can give the little tykes, the Citadel cadets, their final grades for the semester.
Yeah, easy work. Nothing's easier than just grading papers, sitting there watching television while you're doing it. Okay, let's get to business, Richard. Let's talk about an important subject like democracy. So last week, President Biden held his great big democracy summit. And, it was really a way to continue this old Cold War revival against Russia and China. The whole thing was directed to them. The whole thing's a sham to highlight the fact that America's a democracy and China isn't. And of course, in their eyes, neither is Russia. Well, this race has lots of dimensions, but I think the most important aspect of this is Biden's obvious belief that, and the belief of most statists, is that that democracy equals freedom. That if you have a democratic system, that means you have a free system because you're so-called free to elect your political rulers. Well, so I want to start by focusing on that. I think that's the most important aspect of this, something that Biden and other statists just don't realize, that just because you have a democratic system doesn't mean you have a free society. Simply because people are free to choose between one candidate and another candidate doesn't make you free. You could have a dictator that's democratically elected. Let's assume you've got the president of the United States has omnipotent powers. He has the power of assassination, of torture, indefinite detention, round anybody up that he wants, put them in concentration camps. But we get to elect that ruler. Is that freedom? Of course not. That freedom is measured by the nature and extent of the powers that government officials wield and exercise. And it's not just a matter of whether they're exercising powers. It's really a question of whether they wield powers or not. If they wield powers, but they're not omnipotent powers, but they're not exercising them, it's still not a free society, because you know that whenever the government stops being nice, it can go ahead and exercise those powers. It's like having a sword in a sheath. That they'll keep the sword there, but when the time comes and the time is right, they just pull the sword out. And so a free society is where government officials don't even wield these totalitarian dictatorial powers, regardless of whether they're elected or not. Classic examples as the First Amendment. Our ancestors insisted on the First Amendment and said, we don't really care whether you're democratically elected or not. You're not going to have the power to destroy freedom of speech or freedom of religion or the right to assemble. It's just irrelevant how you're put into office. You don't have these powers. So it's not a question of, we will give you the powers and we'll hope that you exercise them in a benevolent, benign, passive way. No, it's a matter of, you don't even have the power to do this, no matter what the circumstances, the emergency, or what have you. So I think it's most important to focus on that aspect of this controversy here of democracy. In fact, I think it's revealing that in the Constitution, the word democracy doesn't even appear. The framers, our founding fathers, they understood that democracy is not freedom. In fact, they understood that democracy is oftentimes your greatest threat to freedom. That majority rule, can easily trounce the rights of the minority, and that's again why we have, for example, the First Amendment. Is that we don't care if 95% of Americans want to suppress freedom of speech. It's irrelevant to us that there are fundamental rights that exist beyond the reach of the majority, and therefore we're going to protect the rights of everyone to free speech, even if it's only 5% that are speaking out against the government, as an example. So I think the whole thing's a sham, Richard, and it's a sham that unfortunately all too many Americans are just still not aware of, that democracy itself is not freedom. What do you think?
Well, I think part of the confusion has arisen because of the historical nature of the fact that the notion of a government that would be duly elected by the citizenry arose simultaneously with the idea of liberty of the individual, freedom of choice in living your life as you chose on matters of religious faith, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, including the marketplace, as government regulations were lifted from economic affairs in the 17 and 1800s. And the fact that, well, if I am free to choose my career and my associations and my goals, should I not have also the freedom to elect those who shall be in office in various capacities in the government for a stipulated period of time? So it all seemed to be like parallel and complementary. And in one sense, they are. But it doesn't change the fact that democracy is merely an institutional tool or method of deciding who will hold political office and for what period of time, elected by some designated and agreed upon portion of the population. It could be a narrow franchise. It used to be only property owners of a certain value. It can be just men, which was the case for a very long time. It can be for everyone, other than, let's say, felons or small children or those who have mental incapacity. Or it could mean everybody, regardless of your age or mental capacity. But all it is a tool for deciding who will hold for political office and for what period of time. What democracy does not tell us per se is what are the duties, roles, and responsibilities of the government as reflected in those who have been appointed to those elected positions. That is why it has been very common, Jacob, historically, to refer to liberal democracy as opposed to democratic despotism or totalitarian democracy or arbitrary majoritarian democracy. Because liberal, in the classical sense, meant that the role of government was to secure people's individual liberties to life, liberty, their honestly acquired property, their freedoms of conscience and association, etc. And that all that was important was that since this is an important role, if a government is to exist, to secure us from the aggressions or the oppressions of others, that we should have a say is who's going to hold office. That people compete openly and freely and transparently for the political office which they may hold if the majority votes for them and for the stipulated period of time, which makes them accountable to the citizens whose rights they're supposed to safeguard. But what has happened is that this confusion arose in the 19th century that a government that is representative of the people cannot oppress the people. How can you oppress yourself? Well, I suppose that you can get out the whips and chains and do things to yourself, Jacob, but we won't get into that. But how can the people oppress themselves? It was viewed as a contradiction. So anything that the government did, as long as the representatives have been chosen by the people themselves, given the platforms upon which they have run for office, is consistent with freedom. Freedom is democracy in that sense, but of course it is not. So when Biden spoke about democracy in this 2-day virtual conference that he held with a selected group of, quote, world leaders. And he railed against the threats of democracy, pointing indirectly, specifically towards the Chinese and the Russians. What he was basically saying is that democracy means the people rule, and that anything that the people want is then democratic. And of course, for him, that agenda is, well, democracy means the welfare state. Democracy means enlightened government intervention, regulation, control, and planning, because that enhances the betterment of the people. Now, of course, at the same time, maybe some of the viewers and listeners may have caught this in the press, that about the same time as Biden was holding his virtual conference, international conference on democracy, the Chinese Communists issued a report talking about their real democracy. Look at the sham democracy in America, a democracy that's resulted in hundreds of thousands of COVID deaths, who causes conflict and divisiveness in society. The Chinese have real democracy because it's a democracy of order and stability, and those in charge representing the will of the people through the Communist Party assure a standard of living, a guaranteed minimum, the elimination of social conflict, because conflict will be oppressed and prevented in the name of unity and stability for all. So would the real democracy please stand up? Everybody says they're for democracy. The real democracy, that is one that is consistent with liberty, is that liberal democracy, meaning classical liberal democracy, where yes, you elect representatives and those who hold political office, and it is for specified periods of time for which they may or may not have the institutional ability to run for re-election. But what that government is to do is specified and delineated as it was meant to do in our Constitution and the accompanying Bill of Rights, to a set of narrowly defined delegated duties and responsibilities, outside of and beyond of which government was not to intrude, infringe, or prohibit or deny the free choices of the voluntary and peaceful and honest free choices of the citizenry. Until we return to that proper understanding of a free society involving democracy, we are threatened with oppressive democratic despotism, totalitarian democracy, and the majoritarian tyranny. And if I can just mention one other thing, this was understood even by those market economists of the mid-19th century who had moved away from laissez-faire. And I'm thinking specifically of the famous economist and political philosopher, John Stuart Mill, who in his rightly famous essay from the 1850s on liberty, warned especially of two types of tyranny: the tyranny of the minority, that's the king or the ruling aristocracy, who may abuse their power at the expense of others for their own gain, or as he says it, the tyranny of the majority, which Mill himself considered the greater emerging danger because of the growth of the voting franchise and the idea that anything that the people wanted became justifiable as long as it was through elected representatives.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that you're combining political liberty, the right to vote, with economic liberty. Because in some of these countries, Richard, you have democratic socialists and the Democratic Socialist Party. Well, socialism is an economic philosophy, not a political philosophy. And as libertarians, we know what socialism does. I mean, it creates poverty for people, creates suffering for people. I mean, if you want to guarantee an impoverished society, adopt socialism. I mean, all you got to do is look at North Korea for that, or Venezuela, or China. China's liberalized its economy to a large extent, but that's letting loose the socialist controls. That's not because of more socialism, it's because of less socialism. So I think one of the issues you're raising is that here you have a system of democratic rule where the majority has imposed a socialist system on America, overlaying what was really a true free market system. And that socialist system is the massive welfare state under which we live. We've got Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, education grants, welfare, FDIC, SBA loans, stimulus packages. I mean, the whole thing goes just go on and on and on. And the idea is, oh, well, this is freedom, Jacob, because the majority has voted this way. Well, most people would agree that the majority shouldn't control what we read or what we're able to say, like criticize the government. I think if you did a survey of the American people, I think the vast majority, if not 95% or more, would say no. People shouldn't be put in jail for criticizing government officials, or people should be free to read whatever they want to read, even if it's socialism or capitalism or what have you. But it's different when it comes to economics, is that all of a sudden the mindset shifts and people say, well, no, this is a majority rule country. This is a democratic country. If everybody or the majority wants this socialist system, then that's really what freedom's all about. Well, it's not what freedom's all about, because what they're doing is they're using the majority to really impoverish or take away the economic liberty of let's say, a minority or even a majority of people. I mean, true economic liberty is a society in which people are free to keep everything they earned and decide for themselves what to do with it. I mean, that was the original capitalist system, the free market system. That was the system that America had for more than 100 years. No Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no mandatory charity at all. No IRS, no income tax. You made it, you kept it, you decided what to do with it. Well, that's the idea of economic liberty, that you're managing your own life, you're deciding what to do with your own money. And of course, it also shows a faith in people helping out others on a purely voluntary basis. The welfare state and socialism completely destroyed that concept. It put government in charge instead of the individual in charge. And it was all under the rubric, well, this is majority vote. This is a majority vote. Now, for a time, as you know, the Supreme Court was declaring much of this stuff unconstitutional, uh, especially under the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Roosevelt's administration. Things like the National Industrial Recovery Act. Okay, well, that was done through majority vote through Congress, the elected representatives of the people. But the Supreme Court says, no, no, no. You cannot do this, even in a society that's based on democratic principles. That the Constitution prohibits this type of economic control. But ultimately, because of Roosevelt's court packing scheme and because he was able to pack the court with his cronies, we ended up with a society where economic liberty is a non-issue now. That really, what people do with their own money, or what purports to be their own money, it really is the government's money, is really subject to majority vote. And that cannot, under any circumstances, be considered freedom.
I think we should also emphasize that once government has this broad discretionary authority, given a presumed, quote, will of the people through the democratic process, many people feel that this really is representative of what a majority wants, whether it be a small majority of just 50 plus one, or 50% plus one, or a huge majority. But the fact is, and the reality of it is, our current democratic politics is based upon coalitions of special interest groups who may make up actually a small minority of the entire population of the country. But if they put together a sufficient coalition on election day, and if they have succeeded in giving enough campaign contributions for a particular candidate to successfully be on to the ballot and make a financially successful campaign, you can easily have a coalition of minority groups, economic and social minority groups, who combined make up a voting majority of those eligible who have chosen to vote, and basically determine and dictate the fate of the rest of the country. And in fact, it's precisely because the special interest groups are so important to those in office or running for office in these coalitions that they try to create for a majority on election day, that each one can pressure the politicians for a variety of subsidies, anti-competitive prohibitions, trade restrictions, governmental contracts, especially in the defense sector, where huge amounts are spent on a handful, what are really a handful of defense-related industrial companies. uh, can be serving what ends up being a minority of the population, given the wider population as a whole, in the name of majoritarian rule. So it's not just a tyranny of a majority, but it's a tyranny of a majority made up of a coalition of minority interest groups, each of which can bring enough pressure upon those in or running for office to get their way at the expense of everyone else in the society.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then those of us that are getting fleeced by this, we have our lives to live. We have things that we need to do, or most people do. I mean, you and I are involved in the think tank and educational foundation world, which enables us to speak out against this thing. But most people are busy in their businesses, their work lives, their family lives. They can't, coalesce in order to stop this kind of nonsense from going on. The ultimate solution, I think, Richard, is really a constitutional amendment that separates economy and the state the same way we separated church and state, where you don't have to worry about every single legislature or Congress coming in and enacting this law or that law and having to garner a bunch of people to stop this from being passed or this being passed. If you have a constitutional amendment that prohibits the government from taking money from one person and giving it to another person, in other words, socialism or the welfare state, now all of a sudden everything changes, assuming you have a Supreme Court that's going to enforce such a thing. And I'm glad you brought up the so-called defense industry, and I always put defense in quotation marks because that's another great big sham. But here you have what purports to be a democratic system that has this gigantic national security state component to the government, which is really no different from the system in China, Russia, Cuba, North Korea. They're all national security states. And it's important to remind ourselves that that's not what America's system was founded on. For more than 100 years, we had a limited government republic. There was no Pentagon. There was no military industrial complex. There was a basic military force, not very large, relatively speaking. There was no CIA, no NSA. These components, what a lot of Americans don't realize, these components, Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, to a certain extent, the FBI, they really are controlling the levers of power. Now, we have this facade that we're electing people in the executive branch or the legislative branch who are appointing people in the judicial branch. But as Michael Glennon has pointed out in his great book, Double Government, National Security and Double Government, which I highly recommended, and those of you that are familiar with my work know that I've recommended this book for a long time. Glennon, who's a professor of law at Tufts University School of Law, he has served as counsel to many Senate committees. He's blunt about it. He says the real power of the federal government lies with the national security establishment. They're the ones running the show. It's where the real power is. They permit the other three branches to have the facade or the appearance of power. But when you've got a place like Guantanamo Bay where people are being held for 20 years without a trial in violation of the speedy trial provision in the Constitution, where there's torture, there's indefinite detention, military tribunals, you know who's wielding the real power of this federal government. So that's another part of the fraud and the sham involved in this democracy summit, is that you may have a democratic system with the appearance of democracy, but when you've got the national security establishment really running the show, it kind of puts the quietus to the old democracy part of it.
Yeah, I think we need to always realize that appearance is not always reality. And what seems like the will of the people, however we want to define it in the context we've been talking about, may be quite different from the reality of it. It's the old thing, like in the Wizard of Oz. Ignore the man behind the screen. Just look at the face being projected, because what's behind the screen is all of the interests and including, as you're saying, not just special interest groups in the private sector, but the influences and power and clout of those in these senior and centralized government agencies. Maybe some of the viewers and listeners remember a British comedy show from, it must be now 40 years ago, called Yes Minister. And it was brilliant satire, written, I read, by two television writers who had strong libertarian tendencies. And the gist of it is that a new prime minister takes over. It's presumed it's a conservative, and he appoints someone to the cabinet, some guy who's running in the party, who's really just a nudnik. I mean, he's just been appointed because he's the useful idiot for constituency support. And now he's in charge of one of these departments in the British government. But who's really running these things? It's a permanent bureaucracy, the permanent civil service. And whatever he tries to do, either on his own or supposedly, given the agenda of the prime minister in whose cabinet he serves, the permanent civil service, they're setting the agenda, they're changing things around, they refuse to implement certain things, they twist it that it all comes out the way they want it for their purposes in conjunction with other civil servant bureaucracies in the other ministries. And it's as if the politicians are just like temporary time servers, and they're the real managers and controllers of the political system. And of course, this is done with biting satire, wit, and humor. You might even be able to still watch it streaming somewhere, but it's like behind the curtain, as that you think that the elected representatives and those who are appointed by them to hold certain positions are really governing and directing policy, quote, representing the majoritarian choice of the electorate following the voting day. But in fact, no, it's this permanent bureaucracy of which the departments you're referring to are a central part. And they really manage and determine the direction, shape, form, and future of where the country goes.
Yeah, no, that's a great point because, in addition to the national security branch, over in the executive branch, you have all the bureaucracies like Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture, Department of Education. Those bureaucrats stay forever. They just laugh when they see these presidents coming and going because their bureaucracies go on and on and on. And that's the real power. I mean, that they're able to ignore presidential decrees and nothing's going to happen to them. In our waning moments, I do want to touch on the political side of this. I mentioned it in a blog post this week on this particular subject of Biden's democracy summit. And that is that, they like to pretend that they're a multi-party system here in the United States, that they criticize China for being a one-party system. But really, the U.S. is a one-party system too. In all practicality, you could call it the welfare warfare party. And it's divided into two wings, the Democrats and the Republicans. It's like the NFL. The NFL is one league divided into two conferences, the American Conference and the National Football Conference. Well, why do I say it's one party? Well, because they share the same philosophy, the same programs. It's really just a battle every 2 years or every 4 years over who's going to control the largesse and the means of power. But if you look at all the welfare state programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education grants, farm subsidies, trade wars, immigration controls, foreign interventionism, foreign military bases, Guantanamo, they all agree on all the principles there. So it's a one-party system. And they really block out from competition the third parties and independent candidates. They have these enormous petitioning requirements, which when these third-party candidates go out and start trying to get signatures to run, they have to hire professional signature gatherers, which means they spend all their money. By the time they get the signatures, if they do, they're in the race, but they don't have any money left. Well, they know what they're doing. And every time they keep raising these petitioning requirements, well, this is just the fraud and the sham of this notion that America has a multi-party system. And of course, the notion is that, we don't want everybody running for office. The voters will get too confused. Well, my response to that is if voters are going to get confused over too many voters, maybe we need to get rid of public schooling, which is another program that these politicians love. And then the other thing is campaign finance laws. When Eugene McCarthy ran against Johnson, he ran this insurgency campaign in the '68 election. He was able to get large donations from a few donors. Multimillionaire that says, yeah, I like your positions. I'm going to donate $1 million to your campaign. Well, what's wrong with that? Especially since you have millionaires running now using their own money and effectively donating to themselves millions of dollars to run their campaigns. Well, when the statists saw what McCarthy was able to do with that kind of insurgency campaign, that's when we get the campaign finance laws to prohibit these third-party candidates and individual independent candidates from relying on the donations from multimillionaires to fund their campaigns. So it's just a big racket, Richard. It's a monopoly racket to keep the one party in system and let them create this facade that they're competing against each other when really the competition is just over control and largesse.
Yes, and that goes back to where we started, that any real democracy is a limited representative democracy guided by the principles of classical liberalism, without which you have neither real representation nor the freedom of the individual.
Yeah, and if you have that kind of system, it really doesn't matter who you're electing. If government doesn't have the power to do bad things to you or good things for you, the incentive to get your person into public office dwindles to non-significance, because you don't really care who's in office, because they can't do anything bad to you and they can't do anything good for you. So on that note, Richard, we'll wrap it up. Thank you all very much for tuning in. As always, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Subscribe to our FFF Daily. And this is our end-of-year fundraising time. If you like our work here at FFF, please consider giving us a tax-deductible donation. This gets us through the coming year and helps us to advance this philosophy and hopefully restore genuine liberty to our land. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.